Hi, my name is Rachel Sanders from Avenir Health. I'm going to be presenting for session 3 on using the OneHealth tool to budget for your TB programs, discussing some of the special features of the OneHealth tool. These materials were prepared with Inez Garcia Baena from the WHO Global TB Program. The objectives of this session are that number one, after this session, the user should be familiar with different features of the OneHealth tool, including budget mapping. Number two, that we should also understand how to use funder mapping, especially to generate resource gap estimates. And finally, that the user understand where some of the self-driven quality assurance mechanisms can be found. The first item is a focus on budget mapping. As you've seen in the previous two sessions, the OneHealth tool produces a number of different cost results. These are all categorized according to a global framework. You can produce cost by intervention, including the cost for different diagnosis options, all your different treatment components, labor costs, inpatient days, outpatient visits, etc., as well as above service delivery or program costs. However, these are according to the cost categories that have been defined in the OneHealth tool. What this function does is allow you to map or generate these costs according to whatever other budget structure you might wish to use. This could include the Global Fund Intervention Framework, Ministry of Finance categories, your NSP structure, or anything else that you might wish to define. Similarly, those cost categories can then be assigned to whatever funding structure you wish to represent. So, for example, the government, World Bank, Global Fund, USAID, and other funders may have identified themselves as sources of funds for different activities. And so what this function allows you to do is map the cost to those funders and then identify which costs are still unallocated or represent a resource gap. We also have a couple of different quality control functions that I want to mention. One is what we call projection review. This is found in the summary outputs and was defined based on a series of errors that we would see typical users making. So we set up a list of the top errors, and then it will run through your file and check to see if that error is potentially present. If it is, it will flag it for you. And then you have the opportunity to either check that input and clear it, or say, that's actually an error and it is a problem that I have now fixed, and then you can rerun. There's also an opportunity to do some cross-checks and see if the scale-up that you have planned has identified human resources as a constraint. So it will compare the human resource requirements in terms of minutes or FTEs to the availability of staff based on what you've entered in human resources. So in many cases, what we find is that there's sufficient provider availability in the early years of a plan, but as there's an aggressive scale up, both human as well as financial resources can prove to be a constraint. So as you can see in this graph, at the beginning of the plan, there's more than sufficient human resources, but as the program scales up, the demands of the program are more than the provider time available. And so this just sets up a flag for you if that's the case, to allow you to think about task sharing, task shifting, training additional providers, if it's a cadre that's amenable to that in a short term, as well as thinking about whether the coverage targets that have been set are feasible given the constraints of the providers. At this point, I'm going to do a short software demonstration. You can see the familiar OneHealth tool structure on my screen now. If you want to find the budget mapping framework, you can go to that icon at the top ribbon, budget mapping. And at that point, you have the opportunity to either configure budgets or load default budgets. So if you want to configure budgets, you can add any different budget structures that you might want to add. So for example, here I've already added an NSP structure, a Global Fund Intervention Framework, and now I want to add an output that's specific for the Ministry of Finance. So you can add those budgets. You can configure all these different budgets. If you want to load some of the default budgets, you can see load default. Under default, you have the opportunity to add preliminary mapping for the Global Fund intervention framework, as well as the TB country objectives and sub-objectives that have been identified by the WHO. So if you preload the Global Fund intervention framework, then it'll show up with all your budget categories pre-mapped. For something that is user defined, you would have to go in and edit your budget categories. So for example, I added a Ministry of Finance budget mapping, and I could understand that they might want outputs by salaries and training and meetings and some other categories that you could define. Once you've provided that structure for all the different categories, you would select which area you wanted to work in, and then you would map budget categories. So for example, here you can see that all the human resources are mapped to health systems, retention and distribution of health and community workers. If you look at the module, you can identify which of the different modules you want to assign and assign them to the appropriate budget category. So I do want to highlight two things. One, you can choose your aggregation options. So I typically like to look at the costs of drugs and supplies at the intervention level. You don't have to do that though. You can, for example, match each of the different drugs and supplies at the item level. And I also typically aggregate the delivery channels unless I have a specific reason to assign community or other care to a different level. So once you've done that, then you can go in and you can see here, I've delinked a few items just to show you in this demo. You can see that monitoring with microscopy might be something that you would assign to TB. You can see all the different HIV, TB, cross-sectoral TB, and malaria items are listed here. And you can see that there's different options that are similar to the intervention framework. So for example, if you wanted to assign monitoring with microscopy to case detection and diagnosis, you could do that there, or if you were going to put it under the treatment component, you could put it here. So for example, also monitoring with microscopy for second line, you could assign that to TB, if it's at the community level, you could say community TB, care delivery for MDR TB, or treatment for MDR TB, case detection and diagnosis for MDR TB. So you can assign it to the appropriate cost category for your new budget, and then you can close. Typically, this is something that will be somewhat time consuming on the first round, but then once it's been set up, it'll take any changes that you make to the cost inputs, and they'll obviously be output in the same budget categories that you assigned. Once you've done that, you can also edit your funding sources. So we have a couple different funding sources that are entered by default, including government, donor, global fund. You can add anything else that you might be seeing as an appropriate source. So you can even include out of pocket if you would be assigning some of the costs to clients directly. And then you can map your different budget categories to the funders. So for example, I've mapped here case detection and diagnosis. You can either map them directly to a funder, 100%, or you can distribute them across several funding sources. And then you can add funding sources and assign the costs. It can obviously vary by year, although I've kept it static in this particular example. Once you've mapped your funding sources, then you can start to look at your results. You can look at results by budget category. So this essentially shows you all your different budget categories and the results. So in this case, you can see those costs I've assigned to TB case detection and diagnosis, as well as MDR treatment and case detection and diagnosis. You can also look at the costs by funder. In this case, you can see that the vast majority are still unallocated. Some are assigned to government, some are assigned to donor, some are assigned to global fund. And what this lets you do is think about what your resource gap might be. Anything that's unallocated is either a resource gap, or if you have items in here, for example, if it's a cross-sectoral application that you should assign to a category of NA for this budget, then you can better assign the resource gap or better estimate the resource gap. You can also look at funding sources disaggregated by budget category. So for example, if you want to look at the assumptions around what the government would fund, what global fund would fund, what donors would fund, etc., you can just generate the map in that way. And then you can also do it in the converse way, budget categories disaggregated by funding source. So it's essentially an opportunity to slice and dice your costs in whatever way you might want to be able to see them, and to allow you to use this one application that you've done of the OneHealth tool for a variety of different purposes. It might be used for the health sector strategic plan, as well as applications to global fund or other donors, and to think about where resource gaps might be that need to be filled by additional applications. So it's meant to be a very multi-purpose tool. So that summarizes the budget mapping and the funder mapping. The other items that I wanted to review as part of this session were under summary outputs. So the first is all the way at the bottom, and that's the projection review. This is your quality control function. It's running the different checks and balances that we've entered on the tool, and it's going to flag them if there's a problem or potentially a problem. So you can see that I had already looked at this, and it said one of the flags was that there's interventions with coverage that scales down over time. And when I checked it, I found that it was flagging that microscopy was going down over time. That's not necessarily a problem because microscopy scales down as expert scales up. You can see my note. So I've overridden it. I've checked it as green and then put a note about why it's actually okay. You can also see that it's identifying different spots where, for example, drugs and supplies used in the treatment inputs have no cost. It's also noting that there's some points where active interventions have no treatment inputs. And if you click on the details button, it's going to take you to the point where all of that can be found. So for example, specifically for the TB program, we haven't in this particular file configured treatment inputs for latent TB, infection testing, resistance testing with LPA for second line drugs, etc. And so if you click the fix button, then it's going to take you to that spot so you could enter the costs for that particular set of interventions. And then it will take you back to the projection review. If you would like to share these materials with colleagues who may not be OneHealth Tool users or have an Excel for tracking, you can export an XLS file. So you see the button in the bottom right. So that's really meant to provide you with an opportunity for sharing or collaboration if you need to with people who are not OneHealth Tool users. All right, the final point that I wanted to show was another summary output, which is that staff capacity utilization can be generated. So this will either show the utilization of providers by channel or program area, or as a % of full-time equivalents available. So again, this is meant to just be a cross-check to see if human resources may be a constraint, along with already identified opportunities to check on financial resources and potential gaps. So this covers the set of special features that I want to discuss in this session. At this point, I just want to say thank you for joining us. Inez and I are both open to questions and comments. We would love to hear from you. So please be in touch if you have any feedback or queries to share. And at this point, I will close the session. Thank you again.